You may feel it already, that quiet tremor beneath your awareness, as if something future and familiar has just reached back toward you. In the language of your inner world, it feels like a code awakening inside your very being, subtle, electric, undeniable. You could think of it as a signal from a more complete version of yourself, a version that's already standing in the outcome you've been sensing but couldn't quite name. And in this moment, that signal is beginning to rearrange the structure of your life from the inside out. You might imagine this activation not as poetry, but as the way some physicists describe entangled particles separate in appearance, yet linked in a field where distance becomes irrelevant. If that idea applies even metaphorically to consciousness, then the version of you operating at your highest potential isn't somewhere ahead on a timeline. It's a frequency you're tuning into right now, like a beacon waiting for your awareness to catch up. And when that signal finally lands, things begin to wobble. Desires that once fueled you lose their flavor. Familiar goals fall apart in your hands. You walk through your day with the uncanny sense that everything is both real and dreamlike, as if your mind is slowly stepping out of an old frame of reference. That sensation is not instability. It's the old structure dissolving. It's the echo of a timeline you're no longer able to inhabit. You may notice a strange pressure behind your thoughts, a tug pulling you towards something you can feel but cannot describe. That is the evidence. That is the shift. It's the unmistakable sign that the broadcast has reached you, that the deeper part of your being has finally opened to receive what it once could not. And if you've been sensing that your life, your entire experience, holds more potential than the version you've been living, consider that this moment is the hinge. Imagine your reality as a vast sealed vault, filled with countless paths and possibilities you've barely touched. For years, you've stood at the door, trying to force it open with the tools you were taught to trust. But the key was never something you crafted. It was something waiting to be placed in your hand. Right now, that placement is happening. Right now, that placement is happening. And as you sit inside that realization, you may feel a subtle question rising beneath your ribs. Where is this signal coming from? And why does it feel like it knows you better than you know yourself? This is where the idea of a future self stops being a poetic flourish and becomes something more like a metaphor for entanglement, a way of describing how your deepest potential can touch you long before you arrive at it. Not as a person waiting on the horizon, but as a pattern vibrating across the field of your awareness. You might think of it this way. In some branches of physics, two particles can mirror one another instantly, no matter the distance between them. No cables, no delay, no negotiation. Just a shared state reverberating across space. Scientists may debate the mechanics, but the image itself offers a powerful doorway. What if consciousness behaves like that too? At least symbolically. What if the version of you that already holds clarity communicates not through times, but through resonance? Pause with that possibility. You don't need to accept it as fact. You only need to notice the way your body responds when you imagine it. Because if something inside you feels a quiet yes, it might be because you've sensed this entangled relationship long before you had language for it. You may notice moments in your life when guidance arrives out of nowhere, when a decision you've wrestled with suddenly becomes obvious, when you feel a wave of certainty that didn't come from logic or analysis. It's as if a wiser, steadier version of you stepped into the room and whispered the next step. These are the experiences people often dismiss as intuition. But what if they're more like echoes, signals from a state of being that already exists? Consider how non-linear time is sometimes described in theoretical models, not as a straight arrow, but as an entire landscape where different moments coexist. If that metaphor holds even partially true, then the most evolved expression of who you are might not be ahead of you. It might be present, vibrating at a frequency you brush against in flashes of insight, déjà vu, or those deep shifts in desire that seem to come from nowhere. And maybe that's why the activation feels so personal, because it is personal. It's coming from you, but from a dimension of yourself that doesn't fit neatly into ordinary sequencing. You may have noticed this entangled presence during times of crisis, too. The moment everything appears to fall apart, something inside simultaneously strengthens. It feels like an inner hand catching you, steadying you, turning you toward a direction you didn't know was possible. People often call this resilience, but sometimes it feels like guidance. Sometimes it feels like an intelligence that sees beyond your current moment and nudges you toward a path that aligns with who you are becoming. Think about the times you've felt drawn to a possibility that made no rational sense, but felt undeniably right. That inner pull may not be an invitation from the outside. It might be the gravitational pull of your own highest timeline, calling you into coherence. When you experience sudden clarity or an inexplicable shift in preference, it might not be random at all. It could be what happens when your present moment awareness synchronizes, however briefly, with the signature of a more complete version of you. Like two strings vibrating in harmony, even when stretched across different octaves. And this is the heart of the entangled self, not a cosmic twin sending messages from a distant future, but a unified state of your own consciousness echoing across multiple layers of time. A frequency that does not travel from point A to point B, but one that you tune into when your internal noise quiets, even for a breath. So when you feel the activation stirring within you, when old desires dissolve, when the world feels slightly less solid, when the air around your decisions shifts, it may be because the resonance is growing stronger. You're aligning with the version of yourself that already knows how to move through this moment with grace, precision, and deeper authority. You aren't waiting for your future self. You're learning to hear it. You're learning to hear it. And when that inner signal grows louder, something else begins to happen, something far less gentle, far less comfortable, yet absolutely essential. You may notice the edges of your old identity start to fray. The beliefs you once leaned on don't feel as solid. The routines that held you together begin to dissolve like sand slipping through your fingers. This unraveling is not failure. It is physics wearing a spiritual mask. Think of two frequencies attempting to occupy the same space. When they fall out of alignment, they don't merge, they interfere. They create patterns that look chaotic from the outside, but inside that disruption, something more precise is unfolding: decoherence. A separation between what no longer resonates and what is trying to emerge. This is how old timelines unravel, not with a clean break, but with a shimmering distortion that ripples through your inner world. You may feel it as emotional static restlessness with no clear source, or as moments of sudden clarity followed by confusion, like the light in your mind flickers between different versions of reality. You may feel as if your life is glitching, as if the world around you is slightly misaligned or operating on a delay. This is not madness. It is the interference pattern created when an outdated identity meets a higher signal trying to take its place. Some physicists use the word coherence to describe the moment a system snaps into alignment, becoming more ordered, more synchronized. Before that moment arrives, there is turbulence, there is noise, there is the sensation of something falling apart, not out of destruction, but out of necessity. Your inner world works the same way. Every time your awareness brushes against a timeline that matches your higher potential, the structures anchoring you to the old one begin to loosen. Beliefs that once felt like unquestionable truth suddenly reveal their cracks. Emotional habits you carried for years start to feel foreign. Even your preferences shift. Food tastes different. Relationships feel different. The very atmosphere of your days grows unfamiliar. It's the psychological equivalent of your operating system updating in the background. You can't see the code changing, but you feel the subtle lag, the temporary instability, the fragmentation of old files making room for new architecture. Imagine your consciousness as a multifaceted lens. Each identity you've worn, each belief you've held, etched a particular pattern into that lens. It shaped the way you perceive the world, what you noticed, what you ignored, what you believed was possible. When your future self begins broadcasting more clearly, the lens starts to reconfigure itself. The old etchings blur. The old angles no longer hold. Light passes through differently. That blurring is what you are feeling. And because humans are wired to seek predictability, the mind interprets this blurring as danger, as loss, disorientation. But in truth, this is the moment the new timeline begins to crystallize, not through effort, but through the soft collapse of what can no longer support your expansion. You may notice memories surfacing that you haven't visited in years, as if the psyche is clearing old caches. You may notice dreams becoming more vivid or symbolic. Time may feel distorted, too slow one day, too fast the next. The things that used to trigger you may suddenly feel muted, while new sensitivities emerge in their place. All of this is decoherence, the unwinding of a reality that has served its purpose, and it often accelerates when you resist. The more you try to hold on to the old narrative, trying to be who you once were, trying to force old desires to make sense, the more friction builds. That friction is the vertigo of awakening many people describe when stepping into a new level of consciousness. It's the discomfort of trying to stand with one foot in each timeline. But when you recognize the pattern, something shifts. The friction softens, the noise decreases, the unraveling feels less like chaos and more like clearing. Because what's dissolving isn't your life. It's the version of you that was never meant to carry you forward. This is why the unraveling is so deeply personal. It's dismantling the thoughts you used to trust, the habits you used to lean on, the emotional architecture you once believed was permanent, and in their place, a quieter, more spacious awareness begins to rise. A knowing rather than a belief, a presence rather than an identity. The physics metaphor is simple noise cancels, signal remains. Your inner interference is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are synchronizing. You are letting go of the version of yourself that belonged to a smaller reality, so you can inhabit the coherence of the one calling you forward. You are letting go of the version of yourself that belonged to a smaller reality, so you can inhabit the coherence of the one calling you forward. And as that coherence strengthens, something extraordinary begins to reveal itself, something that sits beneath the noise, beneath the unraveling, beneath every moment of confusion you've walked through. A sense of vastness, a sense of untouched possibility, a sense that your life contains more versions of you than you ever imagined. It's as though the dissolving of the old lens exposes a chamber you didn't realize was hidden behind your experience, a space that feels ancient and yet entirely new. And if you lean into that sensation for even a moment, you may feel the outline of what some mystics describe and some theorists hint toward a vault of unrealized potentials, a storehouse of timelines that exist not as fantasies, but as dormant configurations of your consciousness. Imagine this vault not as a physical room, but as a structure made of possibility itself, a place where every version of your life, every path you did or did not take, rests in a kind of quantum stillness, completely formed in essence, waiting for your awareness to illuminate it, much like a constellation that exists long before someone notices the pattern in the stars. Inside that vault is the life where you stepped into your power fully, the life where you followed the nudge you ignored, the life where courage led instead of fear, the life where clarity replaced doubt, the life where love wasn't something you reached for, but something you lived from. All of them exist as potential states, not guaranteed outcomes. They require something more than longing and more than effort. They require alignment. They require identity. They require a shift in the observer rather than a shift in circumstance. This is why the vault remained closed for so long. Not because you lacked desire, but because you were knocking with the wrong key. For years, you may have tried to access these potentials through affirmations, visualizations, or forced optimism. Those tools aren't wrong, they're simply limited. They operate at the surface level, attempting to modify the content of your life without addressing the deeper architecture of the you who is doing the creating. But what if the vault doesn't open from the outside? What if it opens from within when the resonance of your identity becomes a match for what waits behind the door? That's the shift you've been moving through. That's the significance of the activation stirring in your awareness. It isn't about learning how to break into the vault. It's about realizing you were never locked out. Think of the vault as a multidimensional interface. Each timeline is like a file stored in a suspended state, and you've only ever accessed the ones your identity was compatible with. When you defined yourself through limitation, you accessed timelines anchored in limitation. When you carried beliefs shaped by fear, you accessed futures shaped by fear. And when you identified as someone waiting for life to happen to you, life reflected that passivity back. But now, the interior of your identity is shifting, and with it the range of possible timelines you can inhabit. This is the core of the quantum metaphor. Potential collapses into reality the moment the observer's state aligns with it. Not through force, not through desire, through coherence. When your inner frequency stabilizes into a truer expression of who you are, the vault doesn't merely open. The timeline that matches that frequency steps forward. It becomes illuminated. It becomes accessible. It becomes inevitable. This is why your old desires have been dissolving. They belong to the previous version of you. They match the vibrations of the old architecture. And as that architecture collapses, the timelines associated with it lose their magnetism. The vault is not shrinking. Your access to it is expanding. So instead of asking, "How do I get what I want?" a more powerful question emerges. What version of myself makes that timeline natural? Because when you become the identity that resonates with abundance, creativity, clarity, or love, you don't chase the timeline that carries those qualities. You meet it. You merge with it. You become the observer through which it can unfold. This is the shift into the vault. Not a journey outward, but a journey inward into the deeper layers of the self, where all potential rests, waiting for you to claim it by becoming its mirror. And once you glimpse this architecture, once you sense how many versions of you are silently waiting, an even deeper realization begins to surface. If your life contains infinite timelines, then sovereignty isn't about choosing from them. It's about learning to stand in the center of them as the one who decides which version of reality takes form. As the one who decides which version of reality takes form, you begin to feel a subtle shift inside you, a movement from reaching toward timelines to inhabiting the state that calls them forward. And from this center, a new kind of authority starts to rise. Not the authority of force or willpower, but the authority of the observer, the authority of the one who sees clearly. This is the moment you step toward the throne within yourself. Not a throne of ego, not a throne of superiority, but a throne of alignment, a seat of awareness that doesn't govern through demand, but through quiet coherence. You may notice that as this inner sovereignty awakens, control stops looking like control. It becomes something softer, more precise, less like pushing reality and more like informing it. The shift feels subtle at first, like realizing you've been trying to steer the world with your hands when the real steering wheel has always been inside your chest. Think of the observer as the central node of your personal universe. Everything you experience, every emotion, every choice, every timeline passes through the vantage point of the one who is aware. Change that vantage point, and reality begins to reassemble itself around the new center of gravity. This is why old techniques of forcing outcomes have stopped working. They belong to a version of you who thought power lived outside, who believed reality had to be persuaded, convinced, manipulated. But sovereignty doesn't whisper in that language. Sovereignty doesn't push. Sovereignty doesn't need to. Imagine a tuning fork. When it vibrates, everything around it adjusts to that frequency. It doesn't declare its intentions. It doesn't negotiate. It simply is what it is, and the environment reshapes itself accordingly. That is the nature of the observer's throne. When you sit in it, your state, not your struggle, becomes the determining factor. This is why your identity matters more than your effort, why your internal resonance matters more than your plans, why your presence shapes outcomes long before your actions do. If you've ever walked into a room and felt someone's energy before they said a word, you've experienced a subtle form of this principle. Their presence shaped the field. Their inner state broadcast itself. And the room, consciously or not, responded. Now imagine that same principle turned inward, governing not just social interactions, but the architecture of your entire lived experience. This is the essence of the throne, a shift from doing to being, from striving to signaling, from chasing outcomes to radiating identity. You might think of it as the difference between a lamp and a spotlight. A spotlight has to aim. A lamp simply lights the room by virtue of existing. When your awareness becomes grounded enough, coherent enough, you stop acting like the spotlight trying to force illumination onto certain areas of your life. You become the lamp. Your state becomes the source. But sovereignty doesn't mean detachment. It means precision. It means choosing without pleading. It means creating without gripping. You may feel this shift most clearly in the moments where you release the need to convince yourself, where the internal dialogue softens, where you stop trying to affirm what you are and simply settle into it. The observer's throne is not the seat of superiority, it is the seat of neutrality, a place where you are no longer at war with your desires or your past or your limitations. You witness them, and in the witnessing, they dissolve. This witnessing is not passive. It is not resignation. It is the highest form of participation. Because when you observe without attachment, you no longer feed the old story with your energy. You stop pouring fuel into the patterns that once defined you. And the moment you withdraw that fuel, those patterns lose solidity. They weaken, they unravel. Not because you attacked them, but because you outgrew them. The throne is not a battlefield. It is a vantage point above the battle. And from that vantage, something becomes clear. Reality isn't waiting for you to win a struggle. Reality is waiting for you to decide. The throne is where that decision becomes possible. It is where your power shifts from external to internal, from effort to essence. It is where your presence begins to shape timelines the way gravity shapes planets, not through force, but through inevitability. And once you feel that inevitability settling into your bones, a deeper question arises. If sovereignty is found in being, then who are you? Once the roles begin to fall away, something almost eerie happens. You start to feel the outline of yourself without the costumes, without the labels, without the stories you've been performing for years. It's like waking up in a room you've lived in your whole life and noticing, for the first time, how much of the furniture belongs to someone you no longer are. And this shedding doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives quietly, precisely, like a tide slipping out and revealing what has always lived beneath the surface. You may notice it in conversations where the words that used to spill from your mouth feel foreign now, as if they belong to a character you no longer play. You might feel it when you return to an old habit, a show, a hobby, a relationship dynamic, and realize your body isn't participating the way it once did. There's a new stillness inside you, a new neutrality, not judgment, not resistance, just an absence of resonance. This is the dissolving identity, not destruction release, not collapse completion. Think of identity as a series of masks you learn to wear to navigate the world. Some were inherited, some were taught, some you crafted out of survival, and each mask produced a frequency, a posture, a way of interacting with reality. But as your consciousness accelerates into coherence, the masks loosen, they become uncomfortable. The frequency mismatch grows too obvious to ignore. You don't rip them off, they simply stop sticking. This is what confuses so many people during awakening. You expect transformation to feel like lightning, clarity, revelation, but often it feels like emptiness, like an inner quiet that borders on disorientation. You're not sad, you're not excited, you're not attached. You're just aware that something is fading, aware that something else is forming, aware that the person you thought you were is stepping aside for the being you actually are. The shedding feels like a soft grief, but beneath that grief is relief, because each role that dissolves frees up energy that was once used to maintain appearances, satisfy expectations, or uphold versions of yourself that were never truly natural. When those roles fall away, their gravitational pull disappears, and in the absence of that pull, your consciousness begins to reorganize itself around a truer center. This reorganization isn't random, it's architectural, it's systemic, it's intelligent. As your internal frequency rises, anything built on fear, scarcity, obligation, or old narratives begins to detach. Not because those things were wrong, but because they cannot survive in the atmosphere you're moving into. They belong to a timeline that has already completed its purpose. You may notice relationships shifting. Conversations that were once easy may feel strained, or you might feel no urge, none at all, to explain your transformation to anyone. This silence is its own form of clarity. It signals that your identity is no longer seeking validation from outside itself. It's stabilizing inward, like a star settling into its own gravity. At the same time, you might feel as if new parts of you are surfacing, parts that were buried beneath the noise of who you thought you had to be. Interests you never explored, desires that feel more like truth than ambition, patterns of behavior that align with a deeper, quieter integrity. This emergence is not additive, it's revelatory. You are not stacking new identities on top of the old ones. You are uncovering the self that existed before them. If the old identity felt like a map, the new identity feels like territory. If the old identity felt like performance, the new identity feels like presence. If the old identity felt like trying, the new identity feels like being. And here's the paradox: the more you shed, the more whole you become. The less you cling to the person you were taught to be, the more clearly you sense the being you have always been. When the costumes fall, the actor disappears, and what remains is consciousness unmasked, unfiltered, indivisible. This is why identity shedding feels both unsettling and liberating. You are stepping out of a timeline held together by habit and stepping into a version of yourself that requires no script, no pretending, no forcing, no hiding. You become the witness, and in becoming the witness, you become free. And once this freedom anchors itself in your awareness, something unexpected happens. Reality begins to respond in ways that defy your old logic. patterns mirror your inner state. The world bends, slightly, toward your coherence. Because when the false identities fall away, the veil thins. And through that thinning, you begin to notice the seams of reality itself. And through that thinning, you begin to notice the seams of reality itself. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in tiny fractures, subtle ripples, small impossibilities that accumulate until you can no longer pretend they're mere coincidence. When the old identity dissolves, perception recalibrates, and in the space where your previous worldview once sat, you gain access to something most people never dare to name: synchronicity, distortion, non-linear echoes, moments where the world behaves as if it's responding directly to your inner state. These are not signs that you're losing touch. They are signs that you're finally beginning to see. You may notice it first in numbers, repeating sequences that shadow your steps, as if the universe is tapping the glass to say, yes, you're on the trail. Or you think of someone and they call you moments later. You remember an old song and it greets you the second you turn the radio on. You hold a question silently in your chest and overhear a stranger speaking the answer aloud. At first, it feels uncanny. Then it feels intimate. Eventually, it feels natural. This is the softened membrane between your inner world and your outer world, the seam where consciousness begins to influence reality with less resistance. But synchronicities are only the entry-level phenomena. The deeper signs arrive as what many people call glitches. These moments don't follow the simple cause and effect logic your old identity relied on. They feel like small fractures in the film of your experience, micro-pauses, temporal slips, déjà vu that carries the weight of memory rather than illusion. You might walk into a room and feel as if you've walked into it twice. You might encounter a conversation that feels scripted, as if you've rehearsed it in a dream. You might notice time folding around you, certain days stretching endlessly, others disappearing too quickly to grasp. These are not errors, they are sightings. You are catching glimpses of the machinery behind the scenes. When the old identity collapses, your consciousness detaches from the timeline that kept everything consistent. And when consistency weakens, new data shows through data from adjacent possibilities, parallel narratives, unrealized potentials brushing up against your current state. It's like noticing the brushstrokes on a painting you once believed was a window. These sensations intensify not because the world is breaking, but because your perception is expanding. The field you once saw as a single, linear stream reveals itself to be layered, multi-threaded, dynamic, a lattice of interconnected moments, each influenced by your internal state far more than you realized. And the reason these glitches feel unsettling is simple. Your mind is trying to interpret multi-dimensional information through a single-dimensional filter. Imagine a radio that suddenly picks up multiple stations at once. The noise isn't a malfunction, it's an upgrade you haven't fully integrated. The chaos is only chaos because you still expect the signal to behave like it used to. But the more coherent you become, the more these anomalies stop looking like disruptions and begin to look like confirmations. You realize they're not random. They follow patterns. They mirror emotions. They respond to focus. They intensify when your state becomes more aligned with your higher trajectory, and they fade when you slip back into old habits. In this sense, glitches have a purpose. They are checkpoints, reminders that you're stepping out of the default timeline and into a more responsive, living field. They appear when you are closest to a breakthrough, as if the universe is whispering, "Keep going. You're touching the edges." Synchronicities act as breadcrumbs. Glitches act as thresholds. Together, they reshape your relationship with reality. You stop viewing the world as something separate from you. You begin to see it as a feedback loop, a mirror reflecting your internal state with startling accuracy. When you're grounded, the world becomes clear. When you're uncertain, the world distorts. When you're aligned, pathways open that logic alone could never produce. This is why, during awakening, so many people describe feeling like the world itself is communicating with them, because it is. Not through words, but through patterns, through timing, through subtle rearrangements in the environment that arrive with perfect precision. These anomalies aren't proof that you're special. They're proof that you're tuned. And when you begin to notice the seams, another shift unfolds. Your desires change. Your motivations shift. Your old goals lose their flavor, and new ones rise with a clarity that feels both foreign and familiar. Because once you see the seams, once you recognize that reality responds to you more intimately than you ever believed, the question becomes unavoidable. What is it that you truly want now? What is it that you truly want now? That question doesn't land the way it used to. It doesn't feel like a wish list or a dream board prompt. It feels like a seismic tremor beneath your identity, because the moment you begin to see the seams of reality, your relationship with desire transforms completely. The desires you carried before, the ones shaped by old wounds, old conditioning, old narratives, begin to evaporate. Not because you lost motivation, but because the you who wanted them is dissolving. The world you were trying to build belonged to a version of yourself that no longer exists. This is the desire paradox, where wanting fades and knowing rises. It happens subtly at first. You might look at a previous goal, career ambitions, relationship fantasies, lifestyle cravings, and feel nothing. Not sadness, not regret, just emptiness. As if the emotional charge unplugged itself overnight. You may even try to force yourself to care, to rekindle the fire, but the flame refuses to relight. This neutrality isn't apathy, it's alignment. It's the clearing of energetic clutter. It's your system making space for something truer to emerge. Because as the old identity dissolves, the desires born from it dissolve too. They were never wrong. They were stepping stones, signals, momentum generators, but they were never meant to follow you into a higher coherence. The frequency mismatch becomes too great. The timelines those desires once aligned with no longer orbit around you. They drift away, like satellites losing their gravitational tether. Yet as these desires fade, something astonishing begins to happen. A quieter, deeper, more resonant set of impulses begins rising from beneath the noise. These aren't wants, they're truths. They don't feel like cravings, they feel like recognition. You might suddenly sense a longing for inner stillness, not because you're tired, but because peace feels like home. You might feel a pull toward a deeper connection, not driven by loneliness, but by a desire for resonance. You might feel a call to create something not for validation, but because your soul wants to express what it has become. These new desires don't shout, they hum, they vibrate. They move through you like currents rather than commands. And unlike the old wants, which were attached to specific outcomes, these new impulses carry no rigid form. They are directional rather than descriptive. You don't long for a perfect job, you long to express your gifts without distortion. You don't crave the perfect partner, you crave connection rooted in truth. You don't chase success, you crave alignment. This is the paradox. As your old desires fade, your true ones finally have room to surface, and they feel different in your body. Old desires carried tension and ache for what was missing. New desires feel spacious and expansion toward what is already present. You may notice that when you tune into these new impulses, they feel like they're coming from a timeline that already exists, as if the future is remembering itself through you, as if you're not chasing a possibility, but responding to a calling. These desires don't ask, they announce. They feel inevitable, like gravity pulling you into the shape you were always meant to embody. This is why the desire paradox is such an important sign of the shift. It reveals that your consciousness is no longer operating from lack. You're no longer attempting to fill a void. Instead, you're moving from wholeness and letting your reality reorganize around that wholeness. And as this new alignment strengthens, you may notice something even stranger. Your desires become less about what you want to have and more about who you are becoming. They become qualities, not conditions, states, not checklists. They carry a signature of inevitability rather than longing. You're no longer reaching outward. You're expanding inward, and in that expansion, the world begins responding with synchronicities that match your new frequency. Opportunities appear without strain. Conversations arrive with uncanny timing. Resources gather around your new direction as if they were waiting for your signal. This is not manifestation in the old sense. This is resonance. This is coherence. This is you selecting the timeline that already aligns with your inner truth. So ask yourself gently, if nothing external mattered, if there were no pressure, no expectation, no fear, what desire is rising inside you now? Not the loud one, the soft, persistent one, the one that feels like remembering, because that desire is not a wish. It is a compass. It is a message from the timeline you're stepping into. And once you recognize it, the next shift becomes inevitable. The desire dissolves into stillness, and the stillness becomes the gateway. The desire dissolves into stillness, and the stillness becomes the gateway. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, a sensation that the inner noise has thinned, as if someone turned down the volume on the entire world. And in this silence, you begin to sense a deeper layer of yourself waking up. Not a thought, not a mood, a field, a presence, a kind of awareness that doesn't speak in language, but in a calm certainty that you've touched something original. This is the gateway of stillness, the doorway behind all doorways, the space you've been circling without realizing it. You may enter it without effort, often right after the desire paradox peaks, when the old wants fall silent and the new truths rise but haven't yet formed into action. There is a pause, a breath, a clearing, and in that clearing, you touch the core of your being. Some call it presence, some call it the observer, some call it the unconditioned self. But whatever name you use, the experience is unmistakable. It feels like stepping out of the storyline and into the awareness that has been watching the storyline the entire time. It feels like returning to a vantage point that has always existed, but was covered by layers of identity, fear, habit, and distraction. It feels like meeting the part of you that has never changed, even as every timeline, every emotion, every belief rose and fell around it. And the more you settle into this stillness, the more you notice something extraordinary. This state isn't empty. It's potent, alive. It hums with a quiet authority, as if this space is the generator room of your reality, the source from which your timelines originate. You may notice that when you sit in this stillness, your mind softens. Thoughts pass through like birds crossing a sky, leaving no trace. Emotions rise and fall without gripping. Even your physical body feels less like a cage and more like a vessel, a temporary form carrying something ancient and infinite. This is the state from which coherent timelines are born, not from effort, not from desire, but from alignment with the awareness behind thought. Think of consciousness as a field, spacious, unbounded, receptive. When that field is noisy, distorted, filled with conflicting desires and fears, the timelines available to you become fogged, distorted, limited. But when that field becomes still, clear, unclouded by the echoes of old identities, something miraculous occurs. Reality begins to take shape around the clarity within you. This is why the greatest turning points in life often emerge after moments of deep quiet, after meditation, after heartbreak, after surrender, after the collapse of an identity you once clung to. Stillness creates space, and space is the medium through which your highest timeline can land. You may feel this shift somatically. Your breath deepens, your chest softens, your thoughts lose their urgency. You may even notice that choices you previously agonized over become simple, obvious, not because the facts changed, but because your state changed. When you enter the gateway of stillness, you stop choosing from fear or habit. You start choosing from alignment. And alignment has a different logic, calmer, clearer, more direct. This is why the gateway is so sacred. It's not a passive state, it's an active interface. It's the space where the observer and the creator merge, where you step out of the narrative long enough to see the architecture of your life, where you stop reacting to reality and begin shaping it from the inside. And the more familiar you become with this stillness, the more you realize that it was always accessible. You didn't have to earn it. You didn't have to master a technique. You simply had to become quiet enough to notice what was already there. The gateway doesn't ask for belief. It asks for presence. It asks for softness. It asks for willingness. Because once you stand in this inner silence, something shifts permanently. You begin to recognize that the vastness you feel inside is not a hallucination. It's the blueprint of who you are. And as that blueprint becomes clearer, a new kind of power emerges, not loud, not forceful, but steady, grounded, inevitable. This is where the true work begins. Not in the noise of desire, not in the unraveling of identity, but in the silent recognition of the self behind all of it. From this gateway, creation becomes natural, not a technique, but a state, not a chase, but a choice, not a struggle, but a signal. And from this point forward, every timeline you touch responds to the clarity of your presence, which brings you to the next step, the moment where stillness becomes action and awareness becomes creation. The moment where you begin to use the tools that only a reality architect can wield. The moment where stillness becomes action is subtle, almost imperceptible, because it doesn't begin with movement. It begins with recognition. You start to sense that the stillness you've entered isn't the end of the journey. It's the control panel, the command center, the vantage point from which reality becomes workable rather than overwhelming. And from this vantage point, 3 tools begin to reveal themselves, not as techniques to memorize, but as extensions of the coherence you've been cultivating. They arise naturally from the gateway of stillness, the same way breath arises from a quiet chest. These aren't practices you perform. They are states you inhabit. The first is the command, not as dominance, not as force, as clarity. From the observer's throne, you realize that creation doesn't happen through pleading, repeating, or wishing. It happens through identity. When you settle into the stillness behind thought, the I you speak from changes. You no longer speak from fear or desire, you speak from coherence. And from coherence, even a simple statement becomes an act of creation. Command is not about declaring fantasy. It's about articulating what is already true in the deeper field of your being. It sounds like I am aligned, I am clarity, I am peace, not as mantras, but as recognitions, as acknowledgments of the frequency you're inhabiting. A command issued from stillness shapes reality because it vibrates from identity, not longing. It collapses possibility into form the way a tuning fork collapses silence into sound. The second tool is the anchor. Command initiates a timeline. Anchoring stabilizes it. You may think of anchoring as the moment you feel yourself drifting back into old patterns, fear, doubt, scarcity, reactivity. And instead of letting those patterns regain control, you pause. One breath, one moment of recollection, one return to the stillness behind thought. Anchoring is not resistance, it's remembrance. It's the deliberate choice to return to coherence when the fragments of the old identity try to reclaim you. When an old fear whispers, "You've lost your way," the anchor answers, "I know where my center is." When the world's noise grows loud, the anchor restores your inner frequency. Over time, anchoring becomes second nature. You feel the wobble, you breathe, you return, and with each return, the new timeline gains momentum. The third tool is the dissolution filter, where command builds and anchor stabilizes. This tool clears the field. It allows you to see through illusions that once felt solid, to recognize that many of your problems aren't entities you must wrestle with, but shadows cast by an outdated identity. The dissolution filter works through inquiry, but not mental analysis. Instead, it works through perspective. When you meet a challenge, you hold it gently in awareness, from the vantage of stillness, and you ask, "What is this?" From the truth of who I am. From fear, a problem looks enormous. From ego, it looks personal. From identity, it looks threatening. But from stillness, it looks insubstantial, transparent, often meaningless. You don't fight the problem, you don't affirm over it. You simply look at it from the frequency of your true self, and in that light, false structures cannot hold their shape. They dissolve not because you destroyed them, but because they never belonged to the timeline you are now inhabiting. This filter doesn't dismiss difficulty, it reveals clarity. It helps you discern between what is truly yours to engage with and what is simply residue from the old self attempting to survive. Command, anchor, dissolve. These three tools form a triad, a living process through which you begin shaping your reality with intentionality rather than reactivity. And once you start using them, you'll notice something profound. The world responds, not instantly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Subtle synchronicities align. Choices feel guided rather than forced. Opportunities feel magnetized rather than chased. You'll sense that life is no longer happening to you, but with you, and eventually, through you. Because when you inhabit the stillness behind thought, identity becomes fluid. And when identity becomes fluid, reality becomes responsive. And when reality becomes responsive, the architect within you awakens fully. You stop living as a character trapped in the script. You become the one writing the next scene. And from that empowered place, with command in your voice, anchor in your breath, and clarity in your perception, the final transition begins, not the ending of one timeline, but the gentle maturation into a new one, a timeline shaped from the core of your being rather than the edge of your longing. This is where the journey turns inward and outward at once, where your presence becomes your compass, where your choices become creative strokes, where your reality begins to reflect not who you were, but who you have finally remembered yourself to be. And now you stand at the edge of this long unfolding, not as a seeker reaching for something distant, but as someone who has touched the quiet center of themselves. Everything you've walked through, every unraveling, every synchronicity, every shift in desire has guided you here, to this calm inner vantage point where the noise falls away and the signal becomes unmistakable. You may notice a softness settling in your chest, a clarity without tension, a presence you don't have to maintain. It simply is. This is the echo of the journey integrating itself, not the excitement of discovery and not the disorientation of awakening, but the steady hum of coherence, the sense that your life is no longer unfolding at random, but responding to the alignment you've cultivated within. And from here, the forward path doesn't demand urgency. It doesn't require force. It invites attention, gentle awareness, a willingness to stay tuned to the frequency you've remembered. Because this frequency, this I am at the core of your being, isn't something you touch once and then forget. It's a homecoming, a return, a knowing that deepens each time you pause and listen. You may find that the world feels slightly different now, not because it changed, but because you changed the vantage from which you see it. Timelines no longer feel like distant possibilities. They feel closer, more pliable, more responsive, as if they're waiting for your presence to choose which one will take shape next. There's no pressure in that choice, only permission. You get to move forward gently, allowing your inner state to lead rather than your old patterns. You get to explore the subtle language of synchronicity with curiosity rather than confusion. You get to anchor your awareness in the quiet places where clarity rises naturally. And if any call to action exists here, it's a soft one. Stay aware of the moments when you return to stillness. Stay open to the impulses that feel like truth rather than desire. Stay willing to meet yourself again and again in that quiet inner field, because the journey isn't over. It's only just begun. And now finally you're awake for it,